My name is Jay Wilson. My day job is I'm a local emergency manager in Clackamas County, Oregon, which my title is a resilience coordinator, which was previously the hazard mitigation coordinator for our county. Currently also I operate as a volunteer for the State Seismic Commission in Oregon. I'm the chairman, and we mostly work at a policy level, but much of our policy focuses on seismic mitigation and tsunami mitigation.
Okay, great. Okay. Can you describe how you've been able to get mitigation activities across to local people and your community?
In our county right now, we've had, since I've been in this position for about 8 years, we've had 2 disaster declarations, and we've leveraged the mitigation funding, HMGP, Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, that's come in. Really, to the focus we've had have been on flood acquisitions. We've tried to, first time we've ever done that in our county, and we've done them really as a basis for the bottom line in mitigation is get the exposure down to 0 for those properties. And we've had support, even though those are hardship projects, even 1 or 2 at a time. And we've done 3 in each of our 2 flood disasters. And it's been good to have the support that we've gotten from our elected officials and our program managers to dedicate the amount of time and resources necessary to do them. But at the same time, they create new challenges too, as you have to have partnerships to manage the properties as open space into perpetuity now. And oftentimes these are isolated parcels that don't connect to anything. So, even achieving mitigation in the real sense of reducing long-term risk, it also creates long-term responsibilities for communities to think out and strategize, how do they use their resources in the long term for managing open floodplain too.
Ask a question. Can you give us some examples of this interface with the community on specifics like these various events? Well,
for each of those events, I've been the person who's gone door to door talking to people and working with them in their expectations about what the process entails. That's often one of the biggest responsibilities because there's so much uncertainty when you approach a long-term grant project like that. And I think there's a lot of blind corners, even when you've done it a few times. Working with federal grants means if there's a continuing resolution in Congress, there may not be funding appropriated to pay for the grant, and you may have all systems go, and then you're telling your resident, I'm sorry, I'm still waiting for clearance or review or approval, and it can be a daunting task for residents to embark on when they're losing, they've been flooded, they're giving up their home, and then they're also in this holding process. So you really have to be an ambassador for mitigation for the sake of the purpose for why you're doing it, and in many cases it's a hard effort. Even when it's the right thing, it's not something that just because it's right doesn't mean it's easy. It's often a lot of work to get there, and a lot of it is building the trust and the relationships with, well, certainly with your residents who've been affected, but also with all of the partners you have to build to get these things done.
Can you describe the skills most necessary to do the job that you do?
Well, a lot of the skills come from doing it too. On a basic level, it helps if you have, if you're process oriented and you think through systematically what needs to be, approached and done. Certainly to manage a long, complex process, but also, mostly you need to be someone who has a strong feeling for the importance of what you're doing, and you see the benefits, because often they're not readily apparent. And understanding this relationship that disasters have in community livability and connecting the relationship that people have with where they live. Because people choose to move places, or they're born into places, but they have very strong sense of identity with a place, even if that place is hazardous and they don't see that. And so you know, oftentimes you're helping them work through their, you know, their relationship that they've had, and often the relationship that they're having to somehow adjust. So, you know, my background is in geography, and so I have a very, I leverage the ability to think about, you know, both people and environment and the way that they interact, and that I try and use that to my best benefit in talking about, you know, how hazards are a part of every place. And if you can accept that hazard and, you know, and kind of face it, it's more empowering than trying to basically deny it or hide from it, you know. And it's actually, for many places, it's why people are there, whether they know it or not. It's nice to live next to the river until the river decides to flood, or it's nice to live on that hillside until there's a slope failure. You know, the things that we want, the amenities we want for these beautiful locations often have endemic hazards that make them that way.
And how do you get that across to people that in the long term it's not sustainable or resilient to stay in those areas? What kind of incentives do you need to have them move out of that area?
Yeah, that's to talk in that way to people who've, you know, some people, they put their life savings into a place like that, and to broach the subject of, you know, what would it mean for you to think about relocating from somewhere. This is the current biggest single effort I'm doing in my local jurisdiction in Clackamas County, Oregon, is working with a group of homeowners associations that have chronic channel migration problems on the Sandy River. And we've only recently mapped the area for erosion hazard as opposed to being flood hazard. And this has completely changed the dynamic of how they see, you know, where they live and the threat of where they're at. And then the options are few. You know, there's not a lot of money to help them, and so we're trying to be advocates for them having some empowerment to take control, and flood insurance is probably the single best thing they can do to at least have some compensation if they have a loss. But there is a sense of pushback. Often when any new hazard map comes out, it's, you know, do you know what this is going to do to my property values? Do you know what this is going to do to my neighbors, and I can't sell my house now? And sometimes that concern is like a speed bump for a landslide, you know, map that may come out for a subdivision. But when you've put a place in a channel migration zone, it's, you know, it's a very different situation, because the land's actually being taken away, you know, out from underneath you. So we're working with our community members around their expectations, and much of this is a shared sense of trust that we're in this with you. We're not doing this to you. You know, we have county assets that are threatened as well, and we're trying to think at a community scale instead of a single homeowner scale.
That's great. So the New York Times helped communicate a little bit of an upcoming potential natural hazard in this Cascadia event, and how in the world do you get your head around it and communicate this upcoming really horrible event that might hit your county, and how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, you're referencing the July 20th New Yorker article about Cascadia, and yeah, it's a great opportunity to heighten the awareness of the problem, and unfortunately it didn't address how much work we've been doing in all these years trying to work on mitigation for seismic risk in our area as well. As the chairman of the State Seismic Commission, we're very happy to tell people that, you know, we've got the biggest level of funding we've ever gotten for retrofitting schools and critical facilities. We were able to leverage a new position in the governor's office to be a state resilience officer, to orchestrate across all state departments efforts to pursue mitigation, but also pre-disaster recovery planning and long-term investments in, you know, risk reduction on a day-to-day basis, not just in a disaster context. And so for my county, I've been very happy that my elected officials have been interested in what this article means to them. Our county administrator, even at the business meeting a week ago, had a statement about this New Yorker article in his opening remarks, and just said how important this is, that we take this seriously. And he's a Northwesterner who came from the state of Washington too, so he knows this very well. And so, our county, just because we've had a strong mitigation program, still doesn't mean we don't have a lot of work to do. We don't have a formal seismic retrofit program for single-family homes yet, but I can see the future, right, because a lot of people have responded to that article. We're doing a lot of operational planning around earthquake safety, but truly implementing mitigation other than retrofitting schools. The whole thing is to try and dial in the decision making at the time of the idea, so that when you're conceiving of that new bridge or that new building, this is there from the outset. You're not having to argue it at some other later interval of why it's important, or come back in after the fact and retrofit it. And it's much more cost effective if it's part of the original concept.
Can you comment on how the messaging helps at the local level to get things more resilient, mitigated?
Yeah, the Japan 2011 earthquake and tsunami has been a great opportunity for us to basically point to something that to most people is a very abstract idea of what a mega earthquake looks like, that in fact affects an entire region, not just say a county or two. And it's probably one of the biggest examples of thinking global and acting locally. When you see schools that had, that children that either died in them because they couldn't evacuate or were damaged, when you see multifamily housing built inside of hazard zones like tsunami zones that create evacuation problems for people. But also going over there and visiting a hospital that was designed with base isolation. It was relocated outside of the tsunami zone and built in such a way that it shook for 4.5 minutes and didn't break a single window. And the return on the investment for that community is the hospital worked throughout the earthquake, and you can't, it's hard to articulate where the return on the money that went into that decision paid back off to the entire community over and over again through thousands of aftershocks. And so for Oregon and for local communities, it's good to look to something and see how implementation, for a community at the idea stage, the implementation, the construction phase, design construction, what it means is there's a resilience dividend there. That if you design it strong enough and for a long enough life expectancy, the cost balance is out, and you're not having to, in 30 years, tear it down and build a new one because it's become too rickety or falling down. I mean, I'm talking in great generalizations, but those are the kinds of examples that that we bring back from another country to share and say we need to do more of this in Oregon for exactly that reason.
And can you get this information into the building codes and communicate with the officials in not only Clackamas County but in the whole area that's vulnerable, so to where that information is considered law for any new projects?
Yeah, there's a lot of ongoing work with, and I'm not a codes expert, but that there's the national codes now that need to be adopted at the state level. And I do understand, the seismic codes are different than they used to be. They're based on local ground shaking potential with national hazard maps. But the thing is, in many cases, we actually need to build beyond the codes. I still personally don't feel that we're designing for this earthquake, the magnitude 9 earthquake, because a lot of our codes don't take duration into account. They're designed for what people think of are California crustal earthquakes that shake violently for tens of seconds. But these earthquakes, like the one in Japan, like the one in Chile or Alaska in '64, they generate strong shaking, not so much violent shaking, but it's shaking that goes on for minutes. And most, structures and the connections in those structures haven't been designed to withstand and be robust enough for that sustained level of shaking. And so when I hear people talk about building a new bridge in Portland, or the need to build a new bridge between Oregon and Washington on the Columbia River, they say we have our current seismic codes, but I still don't feel like our seismic codes are addressing issues like that.
FEMA has a project that's identifying federal programs that influence resiliency. What does resiliency mean to you, and how can FEMA help you to influence resiliency at the local level?
Resiliency to me, and I've had a lot of time to articulate or think about how to articulate this. I used to think of resiliency as something that is parallel to, say, mitigation and recovery. But I really think now that resiliency needs to be measured more as an outcome from all of your investments to minimize loss. And what you have in the end is resiliency after the event, that things continue to function, you continue to have capacity because you've taken steps to avoid loss or reduce loss by design. And so, I see especially mitigation and recovery planning too as these two parallel aims at the same end. Is this vision you have of your community to be much more adapted for where it's located, in a single term. And if you've got a design level event that is going to happen someday, or even exceeding that, if you're trying to do mitigation in advance, either to retrofit older systems to withstand it, or to replace them to a higher standard, or you're also planning for recovery when they get damaged, you have a strategy for replacing them for future events. Often they're the same targets that you have, and so I see them working in parallel tracks to basically bring the community to a level to where it's minimizing its level of disruption and dislocation for people. And so, resilience. The way I like to characterize resilience, though, is it's something that's the emergency managers talk about this a lot, whether they know it or not, especially if they espouse mitigation. But it's often focused through the lens of a disaster. The disaster context is why we're talking about it. But to me, resilience is the opportunity to translate that into a day-to-day conversation that's outside of a disaster. It doesn't depend on a disaster for it to make sense. And it doesn't depend on a disaster in many ways for you to see the benefits of it. Putting in a more efficient, smart grid electrical system that's less prone to failure and outages might also mean greater efficiencies, because it's built with much more modern and robust technologies, and this is where I think those decisions that are made every day to invest in new infrastructure. That's why I think coming through the lens of resilience, it's outside or independent of the disasters for it to make sense. The challenge for us is how do we articulate that value to the decision makers so that they see that this supports their bottom line, and that businesses would want to locate in communities that embrace resilience. If they feel like their power and water are going to continue to work because the community's taken steps to build those in the right way, then why wouldn't they prefer that as a location for their business and for their employees, because they can see the value in that capacity that's inherent in that community's philosophy.
That's excellent. Leads me to my next question. What motivates behavior? What initiatives are appealing as far as tax credits and clean energy projects? You've really referenced that a bit, but it's the change of behavior. It sounds, how do you get that out to the public and to the elected officials?
This is a great point, because I've said a lot of times, as when my hat was a mitigation coordinator, that often I'm not the one who actually implements mitigation at the local level. I champion it, I facilitate it, I coordinate the effort and the resources, but I'm not the one who does building codes or land use planning. And so resilience, is really the same thing. you need local champions who articulate, you know, how these issues are important, and it's a top-down, bottom-up approach to build a groundswell of political will to do these that's based on public will for their need for this attention to be made. And you know, that's, I guess, the easiest case to make in Oregon, as we, the commission that I'm the chair of, delivered the Oregon Resilience Plan to the legislature in 2013. You know, originally it was a policy advisory document for the legislature and the governor, but the bottom line in the report was saying, based on what we know to be our worst case earthquake and tsunami, instead of 72 hours of preparation, we advocate now that people need to do a minimum of 2 weeks and at least 4 weeks on the coast. And that's where it hits home with every single person in terms of the level of responsibility they need to take for how serious this is. And if that scares them, or if that leaves them feeling dissatisfied with what's being done, then, you know, I personally encourage them to contact their elected official and ask what's going on, and to make this an expectation they have of the people that they elect into office, that they're going to work on this, that they're going to take it seriously. And so this is where I see the public will nudging the political will, so that you have that top-down, bottom-up approach to translating the issue into action.
In that 4 weeks of preparation, what does that entail, for example?
Yeah, 4 weeks, even 2 weeks of preparation is daunting for a lot of people, especially when you think about how much water that is per person. It's a gallon a day, it adds up. And so, you know, one of the ways I've at least tried to think about that is, sure, a lot of Oregonians have tents, they camp. If your house is in such a state that you can't stay in it, maybe you can camp in your own yard, you know, and access your resources while you're there. But for a lot of people, that's a real hardship to try and approach getting that much material together. And so, you know, one thing I do say is, you know, we're just calling it as we see it. We're not doing you a favor by saying, oh, 72 hours is just fine. You know, the earthquakes and disasters in general aren't fair. You know, they really hit the people with who have the least means the hardest, and that's a universal issue. And so in saying that, I often say this is a reason why families need to work together, neighbors need to work together, people need to collectively pool their resources and support one another and take on something like this, you know, in a collective fashion. I said, you know, this is one way where planning for something like this actually can empower you to be more connected where you live, and to have that sense of place and purpose and identity and belonging that supersedes the threat, because it's actually helped you invest even more where you live and why you live somewhere. And I think for a lot of our coastal residents who have a certain degree of self-sufficiency for just weathering the winters on the Oregon coast, you know, they should be able to take advantage of that. But the 4 weeks is more of dealing with the level of isolation they're going to face when bridges are broken and some communities are devastated by the tsunami. We're saying this with all, you know, seriousness. You need to take your personal responsibility for your own welfare. If you're choosing to be there, you know, don't wait and think that someone's just going to come in and rescue you in the first day or two.
So for a seismic event of this magnitude, is there enough time to feel that it's on its way? Like, are there some warning signs that are intrinsic in a big earthquake, or does it just come out of the blue?
You know, there isn't any way to predict earthquakes. They do have an approach, I know, in California for trying to forecast when a period of time might present an earthquake based on what would be foreshocks. And yes, the Japan event in 2011, in hindsight, had a foreshock a few days before the magnitude 9 full rupture. But often you only appreciate it in hindsight. You know, that's often where you learn from these things, is looking back at it, and instead of knowing, looking forward. And that's part of what's hard here is, you know, so much of what we deal with in the disaster world is uncertainty. And it's one of the things that I think when you're working with the public about these kinds of issues, it's really important to establish the relationships with your science colleagues in advance so they understand what their role is and you understand your role, that when you're able to talk to the public and to elected officials about these hard decisions, you have some arrangement between you already that you know what you're talking about and why you're saying it. But it's also so that the public knows that you're not just talking for the first time. And even more so, it's good if in advance of these things happening, if we help share to the public, this is how we come to understand what this means. For a volcanic event, for example, it's good for the public to know how we monitor volcanoes so that when we start paying attention to one for unrest, you know, there's been some discussion in advance of, you know, we trust these officials and we're going to make our decisions based on what they're telling us. And there's some transparency here, so that there's, you know, we are all in this together.
What do you do with the election cycles? How do you keep this information going and out there when you're changing leaders?
Yeah, sustaining momentum, you know, as administrations turn over is a real challenge, because you'll have advocates that come in and then you know, once they go, their mandate is gone. It's probably the number one reason why we advocated for having a state resilience officer in Oregon, so that the 50-year resilience plan that we have for the Cascadia event continues to be implemented throughout these election cycles. And that this role can actually have some accountability out of the governor's office for why didn't you do what you said you were going to do. Because our commission, even though we wrote the report, we don't have any authority. We're advisory, and we can complain about things, but we can't hold people accountable. And so having this high-level position that's not tied to any single department, you know, similar to what the Rockefeller Foundation are putting a chief resilience officer in, you know, in the executive level. At the state level, it's really to help orchestrate how land use planning and business development, you know, and transportation planning, you know, they all are working with this long-term lens of resilience in mind in terms of what we're doing. And our commission couldn't oversee the implementation of that. That's what this role is for. And so, you know, that's our single strongest step in trying to have that level of accountability. You know, I call it, because it's a 50-year plan, you know, you can't rebuild all this stuff in one generation. It's multi-generational. And so the whole approach to this is, it's not a sprint, you know, it's a marathon. And even in the fact that it's a marathon, it's a relay race that's handed off every time there's a new elective cycle to the next group that comes in, you know. And so you have to think of it that way.
That's such a great analogy. We had, unfortunately, a really tragic situation with the Ozo landslide. That area had been mapped, it had been identified, it had been on their mitigation plan. It's a difficult one. I don't want to put you in a weird position, but could you comment on how that could have, how do you keep those plans active, and how do you get that mitigation and implementation done?
Well, probably the best thing I can say from a local perspective, our own perspective, is the Oso landslide event has been informative for our county officials to take seriously our channel migration zone study. You know, they see, even though the maps that came out of our study are advisory now, they haven't yet been adopted. They've only been out a couple of months. But initially they, you know, our chairman and commissioners looked at these and said, you know, we're worried about future development in these zones. And we're going to take this seriously about what this means in terms of allowing more people to build in there, since this has been shown to us. And so we're working right now with what's the best means possible to implement something that's going to put more restrictions on where people can build up there. And that's part of what we're doing with community involvement, is working with our, homeowners associations and people there to talk about the implications of this new mapping effort. And so, sometimes these are the benefit, I shouldn't say benefits, but it's the way that we can improve on a situation like that. Is in 2020 hindsight, I think there's probably so many jurisdictions that have zones with development pressures, and sometimes the fear or worry of litigation or that liability versus responsibility is how I like to translate it. Once if you do something, you're taking responsibility. If you're choosing not to, then you're potentially looking at liability. It's important for community members. This is why I think emergency managers are often an underappreciated voice in government, especially local government, to be there for advocates for change to their elected officials, because they see the dots that break over and over again. They see the connective tissues that so many people don't see until they break. And they can be advocates at the decision points for these types of things, especially if they're familiar with their mitigation plan. But it's not a role that a lot of emergency managers see, because it's you're not only an advocate for your community, which is good, but on some level you're an activist for change. You can be a pivotal catalyst in trying to help bring information to the table that otherwise is just a passive process.
You're like an ambassador. This is awesome stuff. Okay, I wanted to ask, because you were talking about implementing what the liability if you don't implement.
Mm-hmm.
What if this foreshock comes couple of days, so we have the blessing of a foreshock? What do you do? What do you try to evacuate everyone west of I-5? I mean, what do you do, and how is it communicated, and how do you not create widespread panic?
Yeah. Well, I guess I would say you don't just implement overnight a program for addressing earthquake forecasts. I mean, California's been working on this for a long time, and they have an advisory body that convenes, almost at a moment's notice after what may be a foreshock, on a fault that could potentially rupture in a much bigger earthquake. That's the challenge we have in Oregon and Cascadia, is we have so little damaging seismic activity in Oregon that there is a sense of complacency there. And the other issue is just there's hardly any seismic movement on the interface between the North American plate and the Juan de Fuca plate. It's just nearly silent. And so it's just locked. And so the point that I think your question gets to, that I try and leverage, is when the media reports we've had a magnitude 4 or 5 off Cape Blanco in southern Oregon, but there's no tsunami. And I've talked recently to some of the people in the media about this, and I said, well, reporting that there's no tsunami is really non-news. And I said, what's really happening whenever we have these kinds of earthquakes offshore is that's the ratchet on the plate, notching one more notch underneath the continental shelf. That's the sign that's loading more strain, and it goes on all the time. Sure, it doesn't produce a tsunami, and sure, no one felt it because it's out in the ocean. But what all of us should think is there goes another notch. It's been doing this for 315 years, and we have these strings of earthquakes all the time, and those earthquakes are what's adding the pressure to the lock zone. So that's the teachable moment I try to take away when we have those kind of events.
You've heard a little bit about the Natural Hazard Mitigation Association Disaster Risk Reduction Ambassador Program. Can you comment on how do you think that would be received at your community? This is for local leaders, people that are engaged in the community, local citizens, to educate them about all aspects of pre-mitigation to post-mitigation, post-storm.
I mean, I firmly believe in the importance of that role, whether it's a role that's, in the emergency management office. this is one thing we've talked about before in looking for resilience or mitigation, risk reduction, is oftentimes you can't choose your champions, they choose you. And you need to embrace them from wherever they come from. And sometimes it might be a fire chief, or it might be a school teacher, and so these are the people who help sound the alarm bell and raise the flag and the issue that then the program managers and the directors and the elected officials need to listen to and take seriously. And so I try and leverage my role in my county to promote this too, but it's something that there's a balance between you can wear out your welcome quickly too if you're too insistent, because a lot of these decisions are competing with all kinds of other really critically important issues. And so part of this is learning the dance or the nuance of how do you tie in what you're doing when there's an opportunity for something else to happen. And disasters provide that in hindsight, but trying to get out in front of it, like we were trying to do in Oregon for this big earthquake, is leveraging people's imagination, other examples across the world. Every time something happens that you can bring it back and tie it in, you really have to think big about that and find the connection. If you wait for it to happen, that's too late to act on it.
Jay, thank you so much.
Yeah. And anything you want to say as with regard to this program and NMHA and its function and?
Yeah, I guess I appreciate the efforts of what the National Hazard Mitigation Association is trying to do, because as one of the few local emergency managers whose actual job title had mitigation in it, often mitigation is relegated to the corner of the room in most communities. And I started working as an emergency manager in the late 90s as a reservist in FEMA mitigation when Project Impact was the banner, and that FEMA said mitigation is the cornerstone of emergency management. And so I've always maintained that as my direction, and all of my roles in the last 15 years in doing this have been focused on mitigation. So I'm a convert, and often converts are the most strident voices for things. But it is important for those of us who do this and are passionate about it to network and support one another and have a chance to discuss and complain, share stories, learn from one another about how we implement and the struggles that we have for what we're all trying to do and achieve. And so now that resilience, I think, is a new mantle for the same effort. Whatever it is that helps communities see this vision and purpose, I think we have to champion that. And even the word mitigation is a phrase that I think oftentimes just bounces off people's foreheads because they don't really know what that means. And so risk reduction, loss avoidance. However you find a way to don't wait for the window to open. You have to ratchet that window open yourself in order to take that opportunity. Yeah.
What help could you see needing from FEMA or other resources that you could use more of to get the job done?
Well, often local communities are resource poor for situations like this, especially for outreach and education, and finding ways to demonstrate mitigation. I worked for a long time when I was in FEMA mitigation, collecting success stories in a post-disaster context. What was put in that prior hurricane that's now been tested? Can we demonstrate that it's been tested? Can we show the cost that it took to repair it last time is a loss avoided this time? And frame it in a very simple context. Because the problem with mitigation is if it works, nothing happens. And because nothing happens, people shrug their shoulders and say so. And so the real challenge is to tell that story and have people appreciate that not only was there no loss, there was no disruption or dislocation, and that the foresight for that investment is the payoff.
That's right.
Yeah, it takes future thinking.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a little bit more than just this
Yeah.
short-term thing that our society has become more accustomed to, whether it's in business or life. It's like what's right in front of you, not what's
Yeah.
out in front of you.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, in having the legislature adopt the state resilience officer position in the governor's office of Oregon, you know, there's not really a job description out there for this. And so, you know, I've shared the way the Rockefeller Foundation approaches the chief resilience officer at the city level. But I also just said, you know, and this comes from years of being in the mitigation role, is, you know, what's really required here is someone who has an ability to work with people well, and they're good communicators, that they work, you know, to foster consensus-based decision making. They have multidisciplinary approaches to problems, but also the challenges are going to be to go beyond just the seismic-driven nature of what this job was created for, and to think about drought, you know, and climate change in general, but also to focus the efforts into day-to-day community and economic development. And so that's why I've always urged that this can't be an emergency management-based function. It has to be something that tries to get out of all the stovepipes. And so, you know, that it is a unique role, but there are lots of different people who could probably fill it in that regard.
So it's really a networking thing as well, of connecting all the resources that are available,
Yeah.
the intellectual resource.
Yeah, and they're, you know, they enable change. They help people do their jobs instead of trying to set up barriers and be gatekeepers. Yeah.
That's great. When is this job being filled in general?
I don't know. You know, the governor's office, as I completely understand, you know, all of the legislature that got passed, they have to process that before it's signed into law. And so they just said they've got a huge backlog of work to do. This is on the radar. They're working through all of it, but you know, that's on their timeline. So I just have offered, as the chairman of the state commission, I've offered to provide any assistance that I can, and certainly our interest in having the best possible person in there. And as I've testified, OSPAC will be there to support the role in this position. You know, however we can provide that assistance for research, you know, getting testimony in that helps with decision making, to vet new studies, to promote new work or programs or policies. Yeah.
Cool.
Sure.
Okay. Can we let him go?
Yeah.